actually works like this. What time do you need? I've got 4 time abilities to tell the time. Transitional time, baby. TT, transitional time. Hey guys, it's Cam from Craft and Tailored, and in this special episode of What Is On My Wrist, we're not talking about one watch, but we're actually talking about 3 watches. We've got a menage a trois, as they like to say in Paris, of transitional Rolex Sport models. So I'm really excited about this one. We had 3 matte dial transitional watches in our active collection all at once, and I figured it would be a great time to talk about Rolex transitional matte dial sport watches. So let's get into the details here, shall we? So to our homeboy, Morgan King. Hi, Morgan. Look at this, 3-on-1, baby. Not 2-on-2, but I got 3-on-1. How about that? How about them apples-ish, watch apples, wapples. So hi, Morgan. Morgan is a homie of ours, and Morgan will commonly wear 2 watches on one wrist, like a BAMF that he is, a BAMF. For those of you that don't know what that is, Google it and check out our friend Morgan King. He's an awesome dude. Can't wait for our next magic show together. I wanted to use this opportunity to talk about an interesting subset of Rolex watches that are very definitively transitional Rolex Sport models. And these watches have generated a cult-like following. And all joking aside, I think that these watches are really cool, and normally we'll have like 1 or 2 of a transitional reference like this in, but very rarely do we have all 3 of the matte dial transitional references. So I kind of wanted to just do this little like trifecta of a video, do a little bit longer one to kind of talk about these matte dial transitional references and kind of do them all together at the same time. We've got 3 watches here. We've got the Rolex Sea-Dweller reference 16660. We've got a Rolex Submariner 16800, and then we've got a Rolex GMT 16750. So what's interesting about these watches is they really are true transitional references, meaning that they've got 1 foot from a design and mechanical element in kind of the more traditional vintage side, and then we also see modern technical advancements that ultimately became kind of staples within the Rolex Sport lineup, even with Rolex's latest and greatest version of whatever. But what's interesting about these 3 exact references is that they all possess a matte dial in a transitional reference. So these are the only references and the only watches that Rolex ever created that possessed a modern case, modern quick set movement, et cetera, but also with the introduction of things like sapphire crystal and quick set date and things like that, also retained the more traditional vintage and desirable matte dial. So they're all different watches, but they're all kind of in that same matte dial transitional vein, if that makes sense. So why don't we start with the GMT first, and then we'll kind of go through each reference, and then we'll talk about the specifics of these watches. So the Rolex 16750 to the untrained eye looks exactly like a 1675, and for all intents and purposes it really is. Out of all the transitional references, it's probably one of the references in this range of watches that has the least advancement in terms of like technical elements or details or whatever you want to call it within the watch. Essentially, you have a matte dial, you've got kind of the same case as a 1675, but Rolex introduced in 1979 for the 16750 the Cal 3075 movement. And so what that offers in a matte dial GMT is a quick set date function, which is, for a lot of us that have more than one watch in their collection, really nice because you can quickly adjust the date in the first position when you remove the crown off the case. But what's cool about this is in 1979, Rolex transitioned out of the reference 1675 and went to the 16750, and the 16750 was in the Rolex lineup for a really long time. What makes the earlier variant of the 16750, like this one, very special is that in the earlier part of the run, the watches retained that classic matte, Rolex Sport dial with a lume that was directly applied to the dial. So it's essentially a 1675 with a quick set date. That's what the earlier version of the 16750s, ultimately are. In the later part of the run, Rolex actually transitioned to a glossy dial with white gold surrounds, which is ultimately what we'll see in today's Rolex. So a much more contemporary, modern style dial, outside of the crystal really remaining unchanged. We transition from that matte dial that we see here into that more contemporary white gold glossy kind of dial with the luminous filled plots. Really, really cool. The 16750 was in production from 1979 to 1988, and only the early variants possess this matte dial. So really cool watch, very in-demand watch, I would say. It's a watch that is on the list for a lot of guys, because I think that ultimately it looks like a 1675. It kind of checks that vintage matte dial sport Rolex or Pepsi GMT kind of box, but also it offers that quick set date function, which I think kind of brings it into a modern element and era. This specific example is from the end of the matte dial run, which ended in around 1984, but it's a really nice example. I love the fade in the insert. The dial has a really nice kind of like eggshell creaminess to the lume plots. It's on a 78360 bracelet, and it's awesome. These watches were also offered on Jubilees, which is kind of nice, so you can either get them on Oyster or Jubilee, but handsome watch. I really like these because they do offer a little bit of a variance in terms of the ability to quickly adjust that time, but it also kind of is, nice having that matte dial and having that vintage aesthetic when wearing a watch like this. So these guys are definitely in demand and have become highly collectible over the past few years. So we definitely hunt these guys out, and really amazing and cool watch with, again, one foot on one side of the traditional kind of true vintage side, and then obviously a little bit more on the modern side with the 3075 movement, offering a quick set date complication. Moving into the dive watches, we've got another watch that is very much transitional, and even kind of more so than the 16750. We've got a 16800. The reference 16800 replaced the 1680 in the year 1979, very much similar to this transitional reference, the 16750. The earlier variants, again, had this matte dial, which was essentially a carryover from the 1680, and it wasn't until around 85-ish that we'll start to see the transition from the matte dial into the more contemporary glossy dial with the white gold surrounds. In 1979, with the introduction of the 16800, we see a lot of modern advancements to the Submariner as a whole. So first thing is that you have a sapphire crystal. So the first Submariner to really receive the sapphire crystal was the reference 16800, and obviously now today the sapphire crystal is essentially standard on all Submariners and in all Rolex watches in general. But it wasn't until 1979, in the later part of 1979 rather, that with the introduction of the 16800, that Rolex included the sapphire crystal. One of the biggest things that you have with the introduction of a sapphire crystal is an increased depth rating. So we see some advancements to the crown and some of the gaskets and things like that, but the depth rating went from 200 meters to 300 meters. So went from 660 feet to 1,000 feet, which from a dive watch perspective is a pretty big deal. Additionally, we see the introduction of a quick set date. So we see that introduction with the 16800, and the other thing is we received a click spring bezel, which is kind of a signature element of Rolex watches now. So that was introduced with the 16800 as a safety precaution, so that instead of having that bi-directional bezel, now we have a unidirectional bezel, which allowed you to set, the pip or the triangle to a specific point on the dial, and then ultimately, instead of being able to loosely bump that around, would offer a little bit more security in a reference point for timing things like decompression and bottom time and all that good stuff. Really, really cool watches, much like the 16750, but in many ways we see a lot more technical advancement in these watches. We do see some carryover elements like a 93150 bracelet with 580 end links. That was, obviously with, 5513s and 1680s. It wasn't until the later part of the 1980s that we see the introduction of things like solid end links and things like that. But again, these watches are desirable because they still have that kind of vintage aesthetic while still maintaining, a modern element of functionality. These watches easily pass, pressure tests. You can go in the pool with them, et cetera, et cetera. I think these watches offer a nice vintage vibe and feel, but also retain some of the things that modern watches yield today that make them ultimately a little bit more functional and usable. So very, very cool watches, and have, again, increased in desirability. I think it's also a birth year watch for a lot of guys, and on the wrist, it wears quite nicely. When you get into some of the more modern Rolexes, from my perspective, the cases get bigger, things get solid, the crystals get thicker, and they kind of get a little bit more on the heavy side. There's a nice balance in this watch, and we'll kind of talk about the difference between the 16800 and the 16660 Sea-Dweller, and how they kind of vary, and also kind of feel different when on the wrist as well. So very cool watches, watches that we definitely hunt out a lot, and it's kind of a fan favorite. It's also a favorite watch of mine. I really like these watches because they kind of check all the boxes at once. So very cool watch. We've talked about the 16750, we've talked about the 16800. Let's talk about the 666, baby. So the 666 is really cool because the Sea-Dweller, like the Submariner, remained relatively unchanged for a really, really long time. The Rolex Sea-Dweller really remained kind of unchanged from its introduction all the way until really like 1981. You had the double red Sea-Dwellers. Prior to that, you had single red Sea-Dwellers. Then you had the white Sea-Dwellers, aka the Great Whites, and those watches really remained, from a technical perspective, really unchanged outside of minor, kind of elements to the dial and minor elements to bracelets and things like that. So in 81, the 16660, or sometimes referred to as like the 666, was introduced, and basically the Sea-Dweller was completely redesigned. So the watch received a new mid case, the watch received a new bracelet, the watch received a new bezel assembly, the watch received a sapphire crystal, a quick set movement. All of these things were introduced in 81. So the sapphire crystal became standard starting with the 666 for all Sea-Dwellers, and same thing kind of with the 16800. The 16800 obviously received the sapphire crystal and all that kind of stuff a little bit earlier than the Sea-Dweller. Kind of interesting though, if you think about it, because this is much more of a technical tool watch, meaning the 666 is a watch that was ultimately used and acquired for saturation diving and guys that were doing welding and needing a watch that was a little bit more ruggedized and built for technical purposes. Whereas, the 16800, not saying that it couldn't, be used as a technical watch, but was probably more for like your recreational diver, not as like technical, not as professional, right? With the introduction of the 666, we see in the earlier examples, kind of in similar fashion to all three of these watches, a carryover with that matte, all white text dial, right? And the dial is subtly different. Obviously, we've got an increased depth rating. With the introduction of the sapphire crystal, the depth rating is now 4,000 feet, which is pretty awesome. We see a redesigned helium escape valve here on the side of the case. And then we also have the sapphire crystal, click spring, introduction of the click spring bezel. So as a unidirectional bezel as opposed to a bidirectional bezel. And then we also see a more ruggedized bracelet as well. So we see, solid end links on the watch. And the cool thing about that is this is the watch that received, the first solid end links for a sub or a dive watch. So kind of cool in a unique kind of, I guess, transition, and very cool because the watch is ultimately a little bit more ruggedized than the other comparable, which would, I guess, kind of be like the 16800. So the other watch that's missing is the no date sub, right? So this is kind of an interesting transition point. The no date sub didn't really receive any kind of updates from the 5513 range until the introduction of the 14060, which was introduced in 1990. Matter of fact, the Rolex reference 5513 sat alongside of these watches, and there really wasn't a transitional period for the 5513 or the 14060 with a transitional matte dial. The 5513 actually received a white gold surround glossy dial, whereas these guys kind of were in there with like the later Submariners of the later part of the 1970s into the 1980s. So kind of interesting that the no date sub was kind of the last Submariner out of these Submariner dive watches, right? This is a Sea-Dweller obviously, but it's in the Submariner family, to receive that kind of transition on dial and things like that. So going back to the 666, also a watch that is in high demand for similar reasons. You have the upgraded case, you have the sapphire crystal, but it's a watch that again is desirable from the perspective that it retains that matte look, but it's also kind of a unique look because you have the sapphire crystal, especially comparing these two, the 16800 and the 16660. I don't know if I added too many sixes there. I had a lot of caffeine today. See? Sponsored by Verve Coffee. The earlier variants that retain the matte dial are again desirable because they're in the earlier part of the run, and they kind of have that again crossover look, but bring a modern functionality to the piece that allows them to be worn and enjoyed and all that good stuff. So thanks for tuning in, guys. I'm really excited to share these three with you. These three are for sale, although watches like this don't typically last long because we have a lot of people looking for these transitional references. So all three of these are available, and I'll provide some links in the description below so that you can check these out and other examples out if you'd like. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe as always. If you're not doing so already, follow us on Instagram. And if you've got questions, we've got answers. Drop us a line at info@craftandtailor.com. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I'll see you in the next one.